To understand the Ork is to misunderstand them. The tacticians of the Imperium classify them as a Xenos threat, a disorganized but numerous foe to be contained. The scholars of the Eldari see them as a devolved, brutish race, a cosmic joke left over from an ancient war. They are all wrong. The Orks are not an army. For an army has a strategic purpose, a desire to rule, to build, to hold territory. The Orks have no such ambitions. They are not a species in the traditional biological sense. They are a living, self-replicating ecological catastrophe, a green tide of violence whose only purpose is to perpetuate itself. For an Ork war is not a means to an end. It is the end itself. It is the highest form of existence, the most perfect state of being, a symphony of violence and noise that is both a prayer to their gods and the very air they breathe. Peace is a foreign concept, a state of unnatural quiet that is physically and spiritually painful to them, a boring gray hell. They were created by their twin gods Gork and Mork, one being brutal, but Kunin the other, Kunin but brutal, for a single glorious purpose: to fight. Their entire biological and psychological makeup is a perfect engine for conflict. They grow stronger from fighting. Their technology is born from the need for bigger and louder weapons, and their very spores released upon death seed new worlds with the promise of future wars. They do not conquer to rule. They conquer to find a bigger, better fight. This singular violent focus generates a force that is unique in the galaxy, a psychic field of collective belief known as the Wa. It is the ultimate testament to the phrase might makes right, a psychic grease that lubricates the gears of reality and allows the impossible to become brutally and undeniably real. The Way is the force that allows an Ork vehicle painted red to physically move faster, not because of any mechanical principle, but because every Ork in the vicinity knows that red-uns go faster. It is the energy that allows a mech boy to weld a collection of scrap metal pipes and angry insects into a gun that fires a devastating blast of pure energy, not because its design is sound, but because the mech boy who built it and the Ork who wields it believe with every fiber of their being that it will work. This psychic field is the source of their impossible ramshackle technology, their baffling resilience, and their terrifying ability to escalate a conflict simply by showing up. A small Ork infestation generates a small Wa, a nuisance. A planetary invasion generates a large Wa, a threat. But the seers and prophets of the galaxy have always harbored a deeper, more profound fear. What would happen if a Wa of a truly galactic scale were ever to form? And at the heart of that terrifying question stands a single titanic figure, Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka. He is more than a war boss, more than a conqueror. He is a prophet, a being who claims to speak directly with Gork and Mork, the living will of the Ork race made manifest. After a near-fatal head wound from a bolter shell, his mind was not just repaired but rebuilt, open to the full roaring power of the Wa. He became a focal point, a psychic singularity for the violent, joyous energy of his entire species. But the great unanswered question the prophecy whispered in the dark corners of inquisitorial conclaves and Eldar councils is what he is truly becoming. What if Gazkul is not just leading the greatest Wa the galaxy has ever seen? What if he is undergoing a terrible apotheosis, his body and mind becoming the living incarnation of the great Wa itself? What if he is becoming a prime Ork, a beast, ascendant, a being of such immense psychic gravity that his call would be an irresistible summons to every Ork in the galaxy? A final terrible note that would unite them all into a single unstoppable galaxy-ending tide of pure, glorious war. The symphony of destruction is being composed, and its conductor is beginning to raise his baton. The war for the scrap world of Hauser's Reach was by Imperial standards a meaningless conflict in a forgotten sector. But for the Orks, It was a glorious planet-spanning brawl, a perfect crescendo of noise and violence. At its epicenter was Gazgkul Threka, a green-skinned avalanche of muscle and iron. He moved through the battlefield like a force of nature, his massive power claw, the Claw of Gork, tearing apart Lehman Russ tanks as if they were made of soft clay, his twin-linked shooter, barking a constant, deafening roar. He was the heart of his Wa, and his boys, numbering in the millions, drew strength from his presence, their own battle lust feeding his in a perfect violent feedback loop. It was during the final push against the planet's capital Hive that a Shadow Sword Titan killer, its volcano cannon glowing with the fury of a dying star, fired its primary weapon. The beam of pure incandescent energy struck Gazgkul dead on, vaporizing a huge chunk of his torso and blowing the entire left side of his adamantium-reinforced skull clean off. He fell a smoking, broken mountain of meat and metal, and for a single stunned moment, the great green tide of his Wa faltered. But in the mud and blood of the battlefield, as his two hearts sputtered and his life bled out, Gazgkul was not dying. He was receiving a revelation. His physical senses winked out one by one, but his psychic mind, the part of him that was already a conduit for the Wa, exploded into life. He was no longer on Hauser's reach. He was standing in a vast, impossible space before two beings of such immense green-skinned power that their very presence made reality buckle. It was Gork and Mork. They were kicking him. "Get up, you lazy git." One of them bellowed a sound like a billion orcs roaring at once. "We didn't make you to go and get crumped by a shiny laser." The other one pointed a finger the size of a battleship at him. "The real fight ain't air, it's everywhere. We's got a galaxy full of things that need a good stompin', and you's the one who's gonna do the stompin'." A vision, raw and brutal, was slammed into his mind. He saw the galaxy not as a map of stars, but as a great field of targets. He saw the red factories of Mars, the golden spires of Terra, the swirling chaos of the Eye of Terror. He saw it all, a glorious, endless vista of potential battles, the ultimate fight. It was not a request, it was his holy purpose. As this divine mission was burned into his soul, the Wa energy of his followers found its focus. On the battlefield, the millions of orcs, sensing their prophet was on the brink, let out a single, unified, galaxy-shaking roar. It was a sound of pure, concentrated belief, a prayer for more war, and that prayer was answered. The latent psychic energy of every single orc on the planet, their rage, their joy, their love of a good fight was drawn from them. It formed a swirling emerald-green tornado of pure, crackling power, a vortex of green lightning that descended from the sky and slammed directly into Gazgkul's broken body. The energy did not just heal him, it reforged him. His adamantium skull plate melted and reformed, merging with his very bone. The gaping hole in his torso was filled not with flesh, but with a solid mass of solidified Wa energy, pulsing with a sickly green light. His muscles, already immense, swelled to grotesque new proportions, his armor groaning and bursting at the seams. His bones cracked and elongated. He grew. The ground shook as his body expanded, rising from a mere giant into a true monster, a being that towered a full 10 meters over the battlefield. When the light faded, the being that stood there was no longer just Gazgkul Threka, the war boss. His eyes now blazed with the same emerald-green energy of the Wa itself. He threw back his head and let out a roar, a sound that was not just physical but psychic, a bellow of pure divine purpose that echoed not just across the planet, but through the warp, a clarion call to every orc in the segmentum. The prophet of Gork and Mork had ascended. The beast was awake. The roar that Gazgkul unleashed upon his ascension was more than a sound. It was a psychic tsunami, a declaration of divine purpose that propagated instantly through the strange, green-tinged dimension of the Wa Gestalt. Across the segmentum, And then the galaxy, every orc, from the lowliest grot to the mightiest warboss, felt it. It was not a voice in their heads, but a sudden gut-level certainty, a recalibration of their very being. For a speed freak in the middle of a death race, the thrill of the chase suddenly felt hollow and small. For a mech boy admiring his latest noise cannon, the weapon suddenly seemed like a child's toy. For a million orc warbands engaged in a million different petty wars, their current battles, which moments ago had been the most important thing in the universe, suddenly became a boring distraction. A new, greater purpose had been revealed. A bigger, better, and holier fight was brewing. And it had a name: Gazgkul. This psychic call was a challenge to the established order. The galaxy was littered with orc empires, each ruled by a warboss of immense power and ego, who had carved out their own kingdom of scrap and violence. One of the greatest of these was Nazdreg Ug Urdgrub, the fabulously wealthy and unnaturally cunning leader of the Bad Moons clan. From his scrap palace on the junk world of Gork's Grin, he ruled a vast empire built on scavenging and the creation of surprisingly effective, if temperamental, advanced weaponry. When his weird boys began gibbering about a big green god roaring from day east, Nazdreg was dismissive. Sounds like an overgoff git who got lucky. He sneered, his massive jaw studded with glittering teeth jutting out arrogantly. If he wants a proper fight, he can come here and get one. We'll see who's the biggest boss then. He gathered his legions of flash gits, his ranks of heavily armed meganobs, and his arsenal of custom-built walkers and tanks, preparing to crush this new rival and take all his stuff. The confrontation came not as a battle, but as a conversion. Gazkul's Wah, now swollen with the addition of a dozen smaller clans who had been swept up in his wake, arrived in Nazdreg's system. Nazdreg, arrayed in his mega armor, stood on a mountain of scrap, his own boys, a sea of yellow and black around him, ready for the glorious fight. The sky darkened as Gazkul's fleet of crude, brutal rocks blotted out the stars. A single massive transport vessel descended, and from it strode the beast ascendant. Gazkul, now a towering colossus of green flesh and dark iron, his every step shaking the ground. His eyes blazing with the raw power of the simply walked onto the battlefield. He did not charge. He did not roar. His presence alone was the only weapon he needed. The Wa energy that radiated from him was a physical force, a psychic tidal wave of such immense power and purity that it completely overwhelmed the local lesser Wa of Nazdreg's clan. Nazdreg, a being of immense personal power, the biggest and baddest orc for 100 light years in any direction, felt something he hadn't felt since he was a lowly knob. He felt small. The raw, primal instinct that lives in the heart of every orc. The instinct to follow the biggest, strongest, and most brutal leader was screaming in his mind. He looked at Gazkul, and he did not see a rival. He saw the living embodiment of Gork and Mork. He saw the promise of a war so great, so total, that it would make all his previous victories look like children's squabbles. His own boys felt it too. Their war cries faltered, replaced by murmurs of awe. They began to lower their weapons, their gaze fixed on the 10-meter-tall prophet. Nazdreg fought the feeling, his own immense pride warring with his primal orc nature. He raised his custom Mega Blaster, intending to challenge this newcomer. But his arm felt heavy, his will drained. He looked at Gazkul's blazing eyes and knew with a sudden joyous and undeniable certainty that his life's purpose was not to lead, but to follow this great green god into the biggest fight the galaxy had ever seen. Nazdreg Ug Urdgrub, the great war boss, fell to one knee, and with a roar that was echoed by his millions of boys, pledged his life and his clan to the great Wah. This scene was repeated across the galaxy. Great war bosses, pirate freebooter captains, and speed freak cult leaders all fell under the sway of Gazgkul's psychic call. A great galaxy-spanning migration began. Orc fleets fighting the forces of chaos near the Eye of Terror simply turned their ships and left much to the confusion of the cornate berserkers they were battling. Orcs locked in a brutal war of attrition with the Necrons on a tomb world abandoned their siege and began the long journey towards Gazkul's ever-moving crusade. It was not a coordinated invasion. It was a pilgrimage, a biological imperative. The green tide was pulling back from 1,000 different shores, gathering its strength into a single monstrous galaxy-ending tsunami in the hallowed cavernous chambers of the Senatorum Imperialis on Holy Terra. The high lords of mankind, beings whose every whim could decide the fate of billions, listened to the reports with a weary, practiced patience. The data came in as a torrent of fragmented, panicked, astropathic whispers from a dozen different sectors. A green tide of unprecedented scale. Orc clans' longtime enemies were unifying under a single banner. A prophet beast of immense power was leading them. The Lord High Admiral of the Imperial Navy, a man whose family had commanded battle fleets for 1,000 years, steepled his fingers. His expression, one of profound boredom. Another great, "Why?" He sighed the words, dripping with the ennui of a being for whom galactic crises were a tedious, recurring administrative task. It is the greenskin's nature to boil over every few centuries. They are a force of nature, not a true strategic threat. The Lord Commander of the Astra Militarum agreed. They are a wildfire, yes, but a predictable one. They will burn hot and bright, and then they will burn themselves out, fighting amongst themselves, as they always do. A representative of the Inquisition cautioned that the psychic readings were unusually potent, but his concerns were dismissed. The Imperium was a vast, ancient, and ponderous machine, and it responded to this new threat as it always had, with a slow, grinding, and utterly predictable application of overwhelming force. The orders were given. Battle Fleet Agrippina, a veteran fleet renowned for its bloody victories in the Cadian Gate, was diverted from its patrol route. A dozen regiments of the Astra Militarum, their ranks filled with hardened soldiers, were mobilized. To the masters of mankind, this was not a galactic emergency. It was a large-scale pest control problem, and they had just dispatched the exterminators. They had no concept of the beast ascendant, no understanding of the psychic apotheosis that had taken place. They saw a bigger orc. They did not see a new god of war. Battle Fleet Agrippina, under the command of the proud and tested Lord Admiral Kars Vorn, translated into the leading edge of the Wa-A-G territory, expecting to find the usual disorganized rabble of orc scrap ships and ramshackle cruisers. Their augur arrays were powerful, their crews the best in the segmentum, but the sight that greeted them was so impossible it was first registered as a sensor ghost. It was not a fleet. It was a moving solar system of violence. Dozens of rocks, hollowed-out asteroids the size of small moons, their surfaces bristling with a chaotic and insane profusion of cannons, launch bays, and crude, leering glyphs tumbled through the void. They were not moving with the predictable burn of plasma drives. They were being pulled, dragged through space by colossal, shimmering tendrils of raw, green psychic energy, generated by choirs of weird boys, whose collective power was enough to warp reality itself. Between these moon-sized monstrosities swarmed hundreds of thousands of lesser orc vessels, a green tide of metal so vast it blotted out the stars. Admiral Vorn, for all his experience, could not help but feel a flicker of fear which he immediately suppressed with cold imperial discipline. "This is not a fleet," he voxed to his captains, his voice steady. "It is a disorganized asteroid field. Our lances will make short work of them. All ships target the largest contacts. Fire at will." The Imperial fleet unleashed its fury. Prow-mounted lance batteries fired beams of incandescent light, each capable of vaporizing a cruiser that tore into the nearest rocks. Macro-cannon batteries unleashed a storm of building-sized projectiles. The rocks were heavily damaged, great molten craters appearing on their surfaces. But they did not explode. They did not falter. They simply absorbed the punishment and kept coming. Then the Orks returned fire. From the surfaces of the rocks, a million cannons of every shape and size, most of which looked like they shouldn't work at all, unleashed a single impossibly vast volley. Guided not by targeting computers, but by the sheer collective belief of the Wagi that DA bullets will find a way, the storm of projectiles did not miss. Imperial cruisers, their void shields shimmering and collapsing under the ludicrous weight of fire, were torn apart. But the true horror came from the rocks themselves. One of the largest, trailing a comet's tail of green energy, suddenly jumped. It did not accelerate. It simply vanished from its position and reappeared 1,000 kilometers closer, its new trajectory placing it on a collision course with Vorn's own flagship, the Fist of Righteousness. Evasive maneuvers. Vorn roared, but it was too late. The moon-sized asteroid, a vessel that defied all known laws of physics, slammed into the miles-long battleship, crushing it like an insect. The final garbled transmission from the dying battle fleet was a single terrified cry from a junior bridge officer broadcast across the sector. They're throwing moons at us. The stars. They're going out. Then only the cold, silent static of the void remained. The Imperium's hammer had swung, and it had shattered against an anvil of impossible reality-bending belief. The destruction of Battlefleet Agrippina was not an isolated defeat. It was the opening note in a symphony of galactic chaos. The Great Wa did not advance like a conventional military force in a neat, predictable line across a star map. That was the slow, plodding logic of humans. Gazkul's call was a psychic resonance that echoed across the entire galaxy, and his followers, their crude fleets riding the violent, unpredictable currents of the warp, emerged everywhere at once. 100 worlds in the Segmentum Solar, which had not seen a major Xenos invasion in millennia, were suddenly besieged. The supposedly secure trade routes of the Segmentum Pacificus were choked with Ork freebooters. The eastern fringe, already beset by Tyranids, now found itself facing a new, equally voracious tide of green. The Imperium's ponderous centralized military command was utterly paralyzed. There was no single front line to reinforce, no single enemy fleet to engage. It was not a war. It was a plague of violence erupting in 1,000 different locations simultaneously, and the Imperium's immune system was collapsing under the strain. The true horrifying nature of this new war was made clear at the fortress world of Praxis Secundus. Praxis was a bastion of imperial might, a world ringed by orbital defense platforms, its surface dotted with impenetrable fortresses, its garrison a full legion of the Astra Militarum supported by a demi-legion of Titans from the Legio Ignatum. It was a world designed to withstand a 1,000-year siege. Lord General Castor, its commander, was a man of iron and textbook strategy, and he was confident. When the green tide of the Wag arrived in his system, he was prepared for a long, glorious, and ultimately victorious defense. But the Ork fleet did something that was not in any of his tactical manuals. The bulk of their fleet, a swarm of rocks and scrap cruisers, bypassed his rings of defense entirely. They made straight for Praxis's single large barren moon. From the command deck of his Sky Shield fortress, Lord General Castor watched in baffled disbelief. His augur officers reported that the Orks were landing on the moon in their millions. They were not building a staging ground. They were attaching things to its surface. Colossal, continent-sized rocket engines cobbled together from the wreckage of 100 different fleets were being bolted and welded directly onto the moon's crust. It was an act of such ludicrous, insane ambition that Castor dismissed it as some kind of primitive Ork ritual. But then his astropaths began to scream. A wave of raw green psychic energy, the likes of which they had never felt before, was emanating from the moon. Choirs of weird boys, numbering in the thousands, were channeling the immense power of the Way, not to guide their ships, but to affect the moon itself, to convince it to move. Slowly, ponderously, then, with terrifying speed, the great rocket engines ignited. The moon, Praxis's constant silent companion in the sky, began to shudder and shift in its orbit. The orbital defense platforms, their guns designed to track fast-moving starships, could not even target the celestial body as it began its slow, inexorable descent. Castor stood on his command deck, his face a mask of pale, horrified understanding. All his plans, all his strategies, all the invincible might of his fortress world were rendered utterly meaningless. He was trying to play chess with an opponent who had just decided to flip the entire table. The last moments on Praxis Secundus were an apocalypse. The sky was filled from horizon to horizon with the image of their own moon burning and breaking apart as it entered the atmosphere. The world's void shields flickered and died, unable to withstand a force of such cosmic kinetic power. Lord General Castor's last recorded words, broadcast on a Vox channel filled with the screams of 1 billion dying souls, were not a prayer or a curse, but a single whispered statement of pure strategic awe. They're not trying to beat us. They're changing the rules of the game. Then the moon struck, and the fortress world of Praxis Secundus, with all its glorious defenders, cracked open like an egg, obliterated in an instant by a weapon born of pure, unadulterated, and terrifyingly effective insanity. The word that echoed through the great wall from the lips of Gazkul himself was a name that tasted of old hatreds and the promise of a perfect fight: Armageddon. For the prophet of Gork and Mork, this was more than a strategic objective. It was a holy crusade, a personal vendetta. The world that had defied him, the world that had birthed his greatest rival, would now be the site of his greatest triumph. The Ork fleet that descended upon the Armageddon system was a force of such impossible scale that it defied all imperial classification. It was not a fleet. It was a moving continent of scrap metal violence and raw green energy that was so vast, it generated its own gravitational tides. The skies of Armageddon, permanently choked with the black smoke of its hive factories, turned a sickly, ominous green as 1 billion Ork landing craft and spore pods burned through the atmosphere. The final, greatest war for Armageddon had begun, but this was Armageddon. This was the anvil upon which countless ways had been broken. Its defenders were the hardest, most stubborn veterans in the entire Astra Militarum. The Armageddon Steel Legion, their faces hidden behind grim rebreather masks, stood ready in their countless chimera transports. The Titan legions of Legio Metallica and Legio Ignatum stood sentinel over the great hives, their war horns, bellowing a challenge to the green tide. And at their head, a figure of myth and legend, was the old man himself, Lord Commissar Sebastian Yarrick. He was ancient now, his body frail under the greatcoat, but his will was a fortress of pure adamantium defiance. His famous Bale Eye, a crude Ork cybernetic he had taken as his own, glowed with a cold fire. He had beaten Gazkul twice before. He would beat him again, or he would die on the walls of his adopted home. The battle that followed was an apocalypse. The Third War for Armageddon, once considered one of the largest conflicts in Imperial history, was a mere skirmish compared to this. It was a war of billions against billions. Ork gargants, walking idols to Gork and Mork, clad in scrap metal and firing cannons that used live squigs as ammunition, clashed with the divine war machines of the Titan legions in battles that leveled entire hive spires. A literal physical tide of green flesh, a roaring, screaming sea of Ork boys swarmed over the plains, their sheer numbers overwhelming the disciplined firing lines of the Steel Legion. For every Ork, a guardsman cut down, 12 more clambered over his corpse. The planet burned, the defenses buckled, the hives began to fall one by one, not to strategy but to the sheer relentless grinding pressure of the green tide. Yarrick knew the planet was lost. The numbers were too great, the wage too powerful. But he would not retreat. He would not surrender. He would grant his old foe one final personal battle. He made his last stand amidst the burning ruins of Hive Hell's Reach, the site of his most famous victory. He stood atop a mountain of rubble and orc corpses, his power claw crackling with energy, his bolt pistol barking defiance. And Gazkul came for him. The beast ascendant, now a towering colossus of a being, strode through the battlefield, his every step crushing tanks and bunkers. He swatted aside his own boys, his blazing green eyes fixed on the lone, defiant human figure. The duel of legends, the final confrontation between the prophet of the Wa'ak and the hero of Armageddon, began. It was not a long fight. Yarrick was the greatest human warrior of his age. His skill and his will were legendary. He dodged and weaved his power claw, scoring deep, molten gashes in Gazkul's iron and flesh hide. He fired his bolt pistol with the accuracy of a master, each shell exploding against the beast's monstrous form. But he was a mortal man fighting a demigod of war. Gazkul laughed, a booming sound like an avalanche. He did not even seem to register the wounds. He swung his own massive claw of Gork. Yarrick parried the impact of the blow, sending shudders through the very ground. But the raw physical power was too great. With a screech of tortured metal, Gazkul's claw crushed Yarrick's, shattering the weapon and the arm that held it. The old man fell to his knees, defiant to the last, his one good eye glaring up at the monster before him. Gazkul looked down, and for a moment the orc respect for a worthy adversary showed. "You was a good fight, old man," the beast growled. "Da best fight." Then he brought his massive iron-shod boot down, and the legend of Sebastian Yarrick was extinguished in a single, final, brutal stomp. The news of his death, a psychic shockwave of grief and despair, spread through the astropathic network of the Imperium. The old man was dead. The symbol of defiance was broken. And for 1,000,000,000,000 souls across the galaxy, a terrible cold dread began to set in if Yarrick could not stop this. Wah! Then who could? With Armageddon crushed beneath his iron-shod boot, Gazkul's gaze, guided by the divine brutal whims of Gork and Mork, turned towards the Sol system itself. His target was not the golden throne of Terra, not yet. It was the red beating heart of the Imperium's war machine Mars. To the prophet of the Way, it was the ultimate prize, the biggest factory in the whole galaxy, a holy site of potential Daka and glorious war machines. To his millions of mech boys, the very idea of Mars was a religious ecstasy, a promised land of gears, pistons, and things to improve, with a custom force field and more spikes. The Orc fleet did not bother with a strategic approach. They simply threw themselves at the planet, a chaotic avalanche of rocks and scrap ships that crash-landed across the sacred red deserts, disgorging a tide of green-skinned fanatics whose only goal was to loot, fight, and build bigger, better, and louder ways to do both. The defense of Mars was a spectacle of perfect logical warfare. This was the holy ground of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and they met the chaotic orc horde with the cold, passionless fury of a divine calculation. Legions of Skitarii, their augmented limbs moving in perfect synchronized rhythm, advanced in flawless firing lines. Their radium carbines and galvanic rifles unleashed volley after volley of precisely aimed lethal energy, mowing down the charging orcs in their thousands. The air crackled with the binary canticles of war, a prayer to the machine god for accuracy and efficiency. From the great titan yards of the Legio Tempestus, god machines strode forth, their every movement a symphony of perfect engineering, their volcano cannons and Gatling blasters erasing entire mobs of orcs from existence with each shot. For the first few hours of the invasion, the defense held. It was a perfect, beautiful wall of logic and fire, against which the chaotic green tide seemed to break. But the orcs' greatest weapon was not their numbers. It was their complete and utter disregard for them. The logic of the Mechanicus was built on the principle of attrition and morale. A foe that takes 90% casualties is supposed to break, and flee. The Orks did not. For every Ork vaporized by a Titan's cannon, a dozen more would charge forward, clambering over the corpses of their comrades, their roars of "Wah!" only growing louder. The perfect logical war machine of the Mechanicus began to falter under the sheer relentless pressure of an enemy that did not care if it died. A warlord Titan, after killing a Gargant, found itself swarmed by hundreds of tank booster boys who climbed its legs like ants, their crude rocket launches chipping away at its void shields and armor until the god machine finally fell, brought down, not by a worthy foe, but by a tide of vermin. The Skitarii legions, their ammunition running low, were eventually overrun, their perfect firing lines collapsing into a swirling, brutal melee against a foe that was stronger, tougher, and seemed to be having the time of its life. The true blasphemy began when the Orks breached the great forge cathedrals. For the mech boys, this was paradise. They swarmed into the holy manufactorums, their eyes wide with a manic, creative glee. They did not just destroy, they looted and customized. They saw the arcane, perfect technology of the Mechanicus not as a sacred relic, but as a collection of parts for a new, better toy. The results were a horrifying, darkly comedic perversion of all that the Mechanicus held holy. A squad of Sicarian rust stalkers, elegant and precise assassins, were captured, their heads replaced with biting squigs, and their transonic blades welded together into a single massive and very crude buzzsaw. A knight paladin, a noble machine of war, was improved with the addition of a dozen extra mismatched guns, its once proud heraldry covered in a sloppy coat of red paint to make it go faster. The Orks even captured a half-finished Titan, throwing out its complex plasma reactor and replacing it with a power source of a dozen chained-up, screaming weird boys who channeled the raw, chaotic energy of the way directly into its weapons. The planet itself seemed to scream under the strain of this great desecration. The constant planet-shaking stomp of billions of Orks, the cacophony of their roaring, and the explosions of their crude weapons, and the raw psychic power of the Wah being channeled through the corrupted forges, created a vibration, a resonance that echoed deep into the planet's core. In the Noctis Labyrinth, a prison of unimaginable antiquity, something that had slept for 60 million years began to stir. The raw, chaotic, and vital energy of the Ork Gestalt was a force unlike any other, a psychic phenomenon that was pure, untamed life and creation, a direct and utter anathema to the cold, sterile stasis of the Necrons. The silent, sleeping shard of the Citan, the Void Dragon, the ancient god of all machines imprisoned beneath the surface of Mars, felt this intolerable noise. Its long slumber was disturbed. A deep, metallic, and impossibly ancient hum began to emanate from the very heart of the Red Planet, a new and terrible player, awakened by the sheer, glorious, galaxy-shaking din of the great Wah. In the chaotic, galaxy-spanning migration of the Great Wag, navigational errors were not just common, they were inevitable. One such error, perpetrated by a cadre of particularly enthusiastic weird boys who tried to find a shortcut to the best fightin', had spectacular consequences. A splinter fleet of several million Orks, led by the notoriously reckless war boss Gitstompa, was navigating the treacherous currents of the warp when their weird boys, in a fit of collective psychic excitement, tore a hole not back into real space, but directly into the raw, screaming heart of the Imperium itself, the Eye of Terror. For any human vessel, this would have been a final, sanity-shattering doom. The very fabric of their reality would have been unwritten, their souls flayed by the whispers of the damned. The Orks, however, were not human. As their fleet of scrap ships and captured cruisers tumbled into the psychedelic nightmare of the Chaos Realm, their reaction was not one of terror, but of childlike wonder and excitement. Kalen, a boy on the bridge of Gitstompa's cruiser, stared out at the swirling vortex of impossible colors and screaming ghostly faces that made up the sky. "Boss," he roared, pointing a green finger. "Look at all dem shouty faces, they look like they're ready for a proper wag." War boss Gitstampa himself grinned a wide, predatory expression of pure joy. The very hull of his ship began to twist and groan, sprouting fleshy orifices and weeping strange purple fluids. "Hada, mech boys are getting proper creative, I like it." The whispers of the Chaos Gods, promises of infinite power, eternal pleasure and forbidden knowledge that would have driven a space marine to madness, were to the Orks just more noise in an already noisy universe. "Sounds like some git is whispering. About a crumpin'," Gitstampa bellowed. "Well, we're the Orks. We're here to give it to 'em." Their fleet, by sheer random chance, crashed headlong into a domain of Khorne, the Blood God. They found themselves in a realm of brass citadels, rivers of gore, and mountains made from the skulls of 1,000,000,000 different species. From the blood-red plains, a legion of demons rose to meet them. Bloodletters with hell-forged blades, snarling flesh hounds, and great-winged bloodthirsters descended upon the Ork landing parties, their roars of pure, murderous rage echoing across the hellscape. The Orks roared back in pure, unadulterated ecstasy. This was heaven. This was the fight they had been born for. The battle that followed was not a grim struggle for survival, but a joyous, brutal festival of mutual slaughter. The demons of Khorne, who lived only for the shedding of blood and the taking of skulls, had found an opponent whose only desire was to shed blood and take skulls. The Orks, who loved nothing more than a good fight against a foe who would fight back, had found an enemy who literally could not die, who would simply reform in the warp to be killed all over again. A knob, his arms severed by a bloodletter's blade, simply laughed and head-butted the demon to death. Warboss Gitstampa himself engaged in an epic duel with a towering bloodthirster, their axes clashing in a shower of sparks, both general and demon roaring with the pure, uncomplicated joy of battle. The other Chaos Gods found the Orks equally baffling and infuriating. A lithe, seductive demonette of Slaanesh appeared before a hulking meganob whispering promises of infinite pleasure and sensation. The meganob, his mind struggling with the concept, asked, "Is it more sensation than when my megadrill goes right through a tank?" Deciding the demon was being mucky and weird, he simply flattened it with his power claw. A lord of change, a master of plots and schemes, tried to tempt a weird boy with the secrets of the future. The weird boy replied, "The only future I care about is day one, where my head explodes bigger than yours," and unleashed a blast of raw, wah energy. Even Nurgle, the Lord of Pestilence, was thwarted. A great unclean one offered a pain boy the gift of 1,000 beautiful new diseases. The pain boy, rather than being horrified or corrupted, was fascinated. He began taking notes, poking the greater demon with a rusty syringe, calling it a proper gold mine of new gubbins for my squig brains. From his fortress in the heart of the Maelstrom, a lesser demon prince, a servant of chaos undivided, watched the Ork incursion with a growing sense of baffled fury. For millennia, his masters had plotted corrupting the souls of mortals, turning their weaknesses into weapons to be used against them. But the Orks had no weaknesses to exploit. They were a perfect closed loop of pure, idiotic violence. They could not be tempted, for their only desire was battle. They could not be deceived, for they were too simple-minded to understand subtlety. They could not be horrified, for their only reaction to horror was to try and fight it. The forces of chaos, the great corruptors of the galaxy, had inadvertently helped unleash the one creature in the universe that was utterly and completely incorruptible. They were a force of pure anarchic nature that even chaos could not control, and they were having the time of their lives rampaging through the demon's own backyard. From the crystal dome of the Seer Council on Craftworld, Iyandan Farsir Iyana Arianal looked into the swirling mists of fate and saw only a raging green inferno. To the ancient and sophisticated Eldari, the Great Wa was not just a military threat. It was an act of profound cosmic vandalism. It was a cancerous psychic maelstrom of base, brutish thought, a tide of pure, idiotic violence that threatened to drown the galaxy in its own filth. The Orks were a shameful reminder of a past mistake, the devolved descendants of the Krork, a weapon the Aeldari's own ancestors had failed to control. Now the mess had returned 1,000,000,000 times larger, and 1,000,000 times more stupid, and it fell to the dwindling Aeldari to try and contain it. Their method of war was the antithesis of the Orks. Where the Orks were a blunt, chaotic hammer, the Aeldari were a ghost-like scalpel. Their fleets, shimmering vessels of living wraithbone, moved through the hidden arteries of the webway, emerging from shimmering portals to strike with breathtaking speed and precision before vanishing without a trace. A squad of striking scorpion aspect warriors would materialize in the heart of an Ork command camp, their chainswords a blur of motion as they decapitated the biggest war boss and his nobs before melting back into the shadows. A flight of fire dragon warriors would appear, their fusion guns reducing a gargant to a puddle of molten slag, and then vanish a moment later. They were perfect. They were untouchable. They killed millions of Orks without a single casualty. And it was all utterly, completely meaningless. Farseer Arianal watched the skeins of fate with growing despair. For every war boss her warriors killed, a bigger, meaner Ork would simply rise from the ranks to take his place, the challenge only making the horde stronger. Killing 1,000,000 boys was like trying to empty an ocean with a thimble. For every one they killed, 10 more would arrive, their spores, seeding the very worlds the Aeldari were trying to save. Her precise visions, her ability to predict an enemy's every move, were becoming useless. "I gaze into the future," she confided to the rest of the Seer Council, her voice heavy with weariness, "and I see 1,000,000 different paths. But they all end in the same way. The green tide simply washes over everything. How can you predict the strategy of a foe who has no strategy, who simply is?" The futility of their elegant war was made brutally clear at the Battle of the Crimson Nebula. The craft world of Bieltan, ever the most martial and aggressive of its kind, attempted a decisive strike. They aimed to assassinate Gazgakul himself, to cut the head from the serpent. A grand fleet led by the craft world itself, a continent-sized vessel of sublime arcing beauty, emerged from the webway to ambush the prophet's personal armada. But Gazgakul's presence had warped reality around him. The Waj field was so dense that it interfered with the Aeldari's psychic abilities, their predictions becoming clouded and uncertain. Their ambush was sprung, but it was sprung against a force 100 times larger than they had anticipated. The Bieltan fleet fought with the desperate, tragic beauty of a dying star. But they were a fleet of raiders and surgical strikers, not brawlers. They were outnumbered 1,000 to 1. As their own ships were slowly and brutally overwhelmed, the Orks deployed their ultimate weapon. A great rock, an asteroid the size of a small planet, its surface crudely armored and propelled by the screaming, focused rage of 1,000,000 weird boys, was hurled directly at the craft world. The Aeldari fleet threw everything they had at it. Their pulsar lances and star cannons blasted away entire mountains from its surface. But the Wa energy held the crude projectile together, its impossible momentum barely slowing. The craft world of Bieltan, a priceless, irreplaceable vessel that had carried the last remnants of its people for 10,000 years, a living work of art that housed the souls of their ancestors in its infinity circuit, fired its own immense ship-based weaponry. But it was too late. With a silent final and catastrophic impact, the crude, graffiti-covered rocks slammed into the elegant, sweeping spine of the craft world. There was no grand explosion, only the heartbreaking sight of the living wraithbone cracking, splintering, and shattering into 1,000,000,000 pieces, the collective shriek of the infinity circuit, a psychic death knell that echoed across the stars. The once beautiful craft world was now a glittering cloud of dust and debris, a tomb for a generation of Aeldari, and a brutal lesson in this new mad galaxy. A big enough rock would always beat the most elegant pair of scissors. Having shattered the Imperium's fleets, smashed the heart of the Mechanicus, and brushed aside the elegant armies of the Aeldari, the Great Wog turned its collective singular gaze towards the ultimate prize, the one place in the galaxy that Gork and Mork had shown Gazkul in his vision, Terra, the cradle of humanity, the throne world. For the Orks, it was the ultimate boss fight, the final level, the one place that promised the greatest, loudest, and most glorious battle of all time. The Ork armada that entered the Sol system was not a fleet. It was a plague of biblical proportions. It was a new seething asteroid belt of scrap metal and violence, a green fog of ships so vast it physically dimmed the light of Sol itself. The defenses of humanity's home system, the most heavily fortified location in the galaxy, responded with the full, desperate fury of a cornered empire. The solar fleet, commanded by the last Lord Admiral of Terra, moved to engage its ancient and powerful battleships, a line of gold and gray defiance against the green apocalypse. From its high orbit, the Phalanx, the star fortress of the Imperial Fists, unleashed a storm of fire from its thousands of gun batteries. The fleets of Mars, what remained of them, joined the fray, their logic and precision, a stark contrast to the Orks' chaos. It was the largest space battle in the 10,000-year history of the Imperium, a conflict that dwarfed even the apocalyptic struggle against the arch-traitor Horus. But it was a battle against an ocean. For every Ork ship the Imperial Navy vaporized, 100 more would take its place, their crude weapons firing with the fueled certainty that they would hit their mark. The Imperial fleet, for all its valor and technology, was being ground down ship by ship in a war of pure, brutal, and impossible attrition. Gazkul himself did not partake in the naval battle. His goal was the world below. He rode not on a ship, but on a custom-built war machine of such insane scale it defied classification. It was a Gargant, a walking battle cathedral to the Ork gods that had been built into the heart of a rock, a Stompa-Moon that was both vessel and ultimate dropship. Protected by the sheer density of the Ork fleet, the Stompa-Moon plunged into Terra's atmosphere, a new green star of destruction. It crash-landed west of the Imperial Palace, the impact a cataclysmic event that created a new molten sea of glass and fire, its shockwave leveling mountains. From the glowing crater, a great ramp lowered, and from it strode the beast ascendant, followed by a tide of his elite Goth Meganobs, the biggest and hardest Orks in the entire galaxy. Their target was clear: the gilded, towering spires of the Imperial Palace itself. The final siege of Terra had begun. A literal physical ocean of green flesh, a billion-strong tide of roaring Orks washed against the final greatest fortress of mankind. The same walls that had held against the traitor legions of Horus now shuddered under the bombardment of Ork artillery. Great Gargants, their cannons firing shells the size of buildings, strode across the Lion's Gate spaceport, dueling with the last loyal titans of the Legio Ignatum. The noise was absolute, a planet-spanning symphony of explosions, roars, and the clang of metal on metal. The green tide was unstoppable, crashing against the Eternity Wall, the final barrier before the Sanctum Imperialis. And there they were met by the last defenders of humanity. At the head of the defense, a shining beacon of gold and blue against the green darkness, stood the returned Primarch Robuta Guilliman. The Emperor's sword in his hand burned with a white-hot fire, and his face, the face of a demigod, was a mask of grim, resolute fury. Around him, arrayed in a flawless golden wall, stood the Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000, the Emperor's own companions and bodyguards. Each one was a hero of legend, their guardian spears and sentinel blades a blur of motion as they cut down swathes of the Ork horde. They were an island of perfect golden order in a sea of pure green chaos, a last defiant stand against the end of all things. Through this sea of carnage, Gazkul smashed his way forward, his claw of Gork tearing apart custodians and contemptibly swatting aside their attacks. The beast ascendant, the prophet of Gork and Mork, finally stood before the avenging sun, the last, loyal Primarch of the Emperor. The fate of humanity, the future of the galaxy, now rested on a single epic confrontation between two beings of mythic, impossible power, while the fate of Terra and the Imperium of man hung in the balance. 1,000 other equally apocalyptic wars were raging across the galaxy. The great Wagi was not a single entity, but a multi-headed hydra, its tendrils of violence reaching into every corner of space. One such tendril, a massive fleet under the command of Warboss Urgok the Unbreakable, blundered into the newly awakened territory of the Sarkovus dynasty of the Necrons. On the desert world of Somnus, the great geometric tombs of the Necrons had just begun to rise from the sands, their silent skeletal legions emerging into the light for the first time in 60 million years. Phairon Zet, the ruler of this dynasty, was a being of cold, calculating logic, and he viewed the approaching Ork fleet not as a threat, but as a pestilence, a biological contamination to be sterilized. He was, after all, a veteran of the war in heaven. He had fought the Krork, the Orks' mighty ancestors. These devolved, brutish descendants would be a trivial matter to purge. The Ork landing was a chaotic, noisy, and typically unsubtle affair. Their ships crash-landed in clouds of dust and fire, and from the wreckage poured a roaring green tide of boys, their minds filled with the simple, joyous prospect of a new and shiny enemy to fight. The Necron response was the complete antithesis. From the gates of their newly risen pyramid fortresses, phalanxes of Necron warriors marched forth in perfect, unnerving silence. Their advance was not a charge. It was a synchronized, inexorable march, their every movement calculated and precise. The battle that followed was a clash of two opposing universal forces, the chaotic vital energy of the Wagi against the cold, sterile, and deathless order of the Necrons. Initially, the Necrons' superiority was absolute. The charging Ork boys were met with silent volleys of green gauss fire that did not explode, but simply unmade them, stripping them apart, layer by layer, into shimmering atoms. The Necrons' living metal bodies were almost impervious to the Orks' crude, inaccurate bullets. The Orks, for their part, were having the time of their lives. They had found an enemy that was right killy and didn't run away. The most frustrating and therefore most exciting part for them was the Necrons' reanimation protocols. An Ork Nob would bring his massive choppa down on a Necron warrior, shattering it into a dozen pieces, only to watch in delighted fury as the pieces crawled back together, the warrior reforming to continue the fight. Wise Royt, sturdy the Nob, would roar in appreciation. Good fightin'. But the sheer unrelenting number of Orks and the immense reality-bending power of the Wagi field they generated began to have an effect. The laws of physics on the planet Somnus were becoming suggestions. A mech boy named Gitsnik, frustrated that his custom Mega Blaster wasn't killing him, did enough tinkered with it on the battlefield. He welded a few extra wires to it, bolted on a shiny plate. He'd ripped off a fallen Necron and held it aloft. "Oi, lads," he roared to his mates. "I've made this shooter so it kills the shiny skeely boys for good. It's proper dead cunning now." There was no technological reason for this to be true, but Gitsnik believed it, and the hundreds of Orks around him, seeing his confidence, believed it too. And because they believed it, it became real. The next time Gitsnik fired his Mega Blaster, the beam of energy that erupted from it was a different, more intense shade of green. It struck a Necron immortal, and instead of just blasting it apart, the living metal of the immortal sizzled, corroded, and dissolved into a bubbling, inert slag that could not reanimate. A cheer went up from the Orks. They had seen it work. And now they all believed. The effect spread like a virus of belief. The bullets from their simple shooters, now infused with the psychic certainty of the way that they could permanently kill the Necrons, began to do just that. The Necrons' greatest advantage, their immortality, was being short-circuited by the sheer brute force idiocy of their opponents. From his command throne deep within the tomb, Phairon Zet watched his sensor data with a growing sense of logical dissonance. His warriors, beings of perfect, timeless technology, were being permanently destroyed by weapons that violated every known law of physics. He was a being of pure, cold logic facing an enemy whose greatest weapon was its own reality-breaking insanity. For the first time in 60 million years, the Necron Lord was facing a variable that it could not calculate, and the perfect, silent order of his tomb was beginning to drown in the joyous, chaotic roar of the Wah. As Gazkul's great Wah rampaged across the galaxy, a force of a different but equally absolute nature was approaching from the cold intergalactic void. It was a splinter of Hive Fleet Leviathan, a great silent tide of organic starships, a shadow of hunger that stretched across 1,000 light years. The Tyranids had come drawn by the psychic beacon of a galaxy in turmoil, a banquet of delicious, screaming biomass. Their arrival was preceded by their greatest weapon, the Shadow in the Warp, a crushing wave of pure psychic terror designed to shatter the sanity of entire worlds, to leave their prey paralyzed with mindless dread before the feast began. This psychic shockwave washed over the leading edge of the Ork armada. For any other species, it would have been a prelude to annihilation. For the Orks, it was a minor annoyance. Their own collective psychic field, the raw, roaring, and joyous power of the wave, was a hurricane of pure, idiotic self-confidence that simply drowned out the Tyranid's psychic whispers of fear. To a weird boy, the Shadow in the Warp didn't feel like soul-crushing terror. It felt like a really big git on the other side of Dayblock trying to shout louder than us. The Orks' response to this psychic challenge was not fear, but indignation. They roared back a bellow of pure, unified belligerence, a psychic declaration that they were the biggest, loudest, and meanest force in this part of the galaxy. The first physical contact was a clash of predators, Tyranid lictors and genostealers. The vanguard organisms of the Hive Fleet materialized on an Ork-infested world, their purpose to sow terror and sabotage the planet's defenses. They were masters of stealth and ambush, perfect killing machines. They found themselves in a world that did not know the meaning of fear and whose only defense was an offense. A lictor perfectly camouflaged was spotted by a grot, who instead of screaming excitedly pointed and yelled, "Oi, look at dat funny-looking squig." A horde of boys, delighted by the prospect of a new and interesting fight, promptly charged the lictor's position, their crude choppas swinging. The perfect hunters of the Tyranid race found themselves being joyously and enthusiastically hunted by an enemy that saw them as a new and exciting form of violent sport. Then the main fleets met. It was a confrontation of two cosmic biological tides, two different expressions of a single universal imperative: consumption. The Tyranid fleet was a thing of silent organic horror, a swarm of living ships that moved with a single unified purpose to devour all biomass. The Ork fleet was a thing of loud, chaotic industrial violence, a ramshackle armada of scrap and belief that moved with a single unified purpose to find the biggest fight. It was the endless feast meeting, the endless war. The battle that erupted was the one that both species had been created for. It was a war of perfect, horrifying symbiosis. The Tyranids unleashed waves of hormagaunts and termagants, a tide of claws and teeth that crashed against the green tide of the Ork boys. Millions died on both sides every second, but neither side cared. The Tyranids, in killing the Orks, inadvertently seeded the worlds they fought on with Ork spores, guaranteeing a fresh crop of future biomass and future resistance. The Orks, in killing the Tyranids, found a source of the best bits they had ever seen. Mech boys gleefully looted the corpses of carnifexes and hive tyrants, welding their diamond-hard chitinous plates onto their battle wagons and their biocannons onto the arms of their gargants, creating bizarre, terrifying, and surprisingly effective Ork-Tyranid hybrid war machines. The Tyranids, a species that evolved to overcome any foe, had found an enemy that became stronger and more populous the more they killed it. The Orks, a species that lived only for the joy of battle, had found the perfect opponent. an enemy that was endless, that only ever wanted to fight, and that dropped the best loot. The war between the two was not a campaign. It was the beginning of a new, permanent and self-sustaining state of being for entire galactic sectors. It was a meat grinder on a cosmic scale, the ultimate nightmare for every other living thing in the galaxy, and the ultimate joyous fulfillment of the Orks' divine purpose. The Great Waya did not conquer the galaxy in the human sense. It did not establish a new Imperium or a cohesive empire. That would have required a level of patience and administrative skill that the Orks as a species found profoundly and deeply boring. Instead, the Wa had simply and brutally consumed everything. With the Imperium shattered into 1,000 warring remnants, the Aeldari in mourning, the Necrons locked in a nonsensical war of attrition, and the Tyranids engaged in an endless grinding stalemate, the Orks had become the single dominant biological and cultural force in the galaxy. Their victory was not one of rule, but of ecological transformation. They did not govern the galaxy. They had simply turned it green. This process of Orky forming was a biological and industrial inevitability. Worlds that fell to the green tide were not occupied. They were repurposed with the single-minded, chaotic creativity of the Ork race. Former Forge worlds, like the now unrecognizable Mars, were transformed into mech worlds. Their once holy manufactorums were now vast, continent-spanning junkyards, their skies permanently choked with thick, greasy black smoke from a billion unregulated forges. Rivers of molten slag and bubbling toxic chemicals flowed between mountains of scrap metal where mech boys and their grot assistants worked endlessly, creating ever more ludicrous and deadly war machines. The entire planet had become a noisy, polluted, and terrifyingly productive factory floor. Its only purpose, the creation of more and better Daka. Former agri-worlds, once the breadbaskets of the Imperium, were met a different fate. They became squig worlds. The endless golden fields were gone, replaced by a squelching fungal morass that stretched from pole to pole. The ground was a carpet of thick, rubbery orc fungus, and the air was thick with the spores that sustained the new ecosystem. These worlds were overrun by billions of squigs of every conceivable shape and size. There were tiny, biting squigs used for food and target practice, larger, more aggressive squig hounds used for hunting, and colossal building-sized gargant squigs that were fitted with cannons and prodded into battle. The planet's sole purpose was to breed the living ecosystem of the Wahi. Its food, its beasts of burden, and its living ammunition. Even the great hive worlds were transformed. Their towering, crowded spires were toppled and smashed, their ruins rearranged to create vast, planet-spanning racetracks and demolition arenas. These became speed worlds, the holy ground of the speed freak cults. The skies, already polluted, were now perpetually filled with the roar of crude jet engines and the smoke of burning promethium. Millions of orc drivers in their spike-covered buggies, trucks and warbikes raced endlessly through the canyons of the ruined hives, their races as much a brutal high-speed battle as they were a competition. The entire planet was a playground for the fastest, most reckless, and most explosion-obsessed members of the orc race. Underpinning all of this was a fundamental biological takeover. The spores released by every orc in life and in death were astonishingly resilient. They took root in any environment, from the deserts of Talern to the ice wastes of Valhalla. A new fungal ecosystem would sprout, choking out all native life. The very atmosphere of conquered worlds would change, becoming thicker, damper, and rich with the spores and fungal matter that the orcs breathed, an environment they called the Orc Spire. The galaxy was no longer a collection of diverse human and Xenos worlds. It was a slowly homogenizing orc breeding ground, a single vast and interconnected ecosystem of violence, noise, and pollution. The silent void between the stars was now filled with the constant anarchic chatter of Orc Vox transmissions and the rumble of their ramshackle fleets. The galaxy was not dead. In a way, it was more horribly, chaotically, and loudly alive than it had ever been. In the new Ork galaxy, the concept of Xenos had been redefined. Any non-Ork creature was now classified under one of two simple practical categories: good fightin' or grot. The survivors of humanity, with their frail bodies and lack of a proper love for violence, fell squarely into the latter. They were now the lowest rung on the galactic ladder, a race of slaves whose only purpose was to serve the whims of their green-skinned masters. For Alaric, a former administratum clerk from a civilized world that had fallen in the first wave, this new reality was a waking nightmare from which there was no escape. His old life of data slates, quiet routine, and ordered society was a memory so distant, it felt like a dream. His new life was a constant, desperate struggle for survival in a universe that viewed him as something less than cattle. His day began not with the chime of a chronometer, but with the brutal, iron-shod kick of a knob rousing the human grots from their sleep in the squalid, mud-choked pens they called home. Alaric, like the hundreds of other emaciated humans around him, scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding with the familiar daily terror. A moment of slowness, a perceived sign of laziness, could result in a casual, thoughtless execution. Their work was as varied as it was lethal. One day, Alaric might be a grease grot forced to crawl into the grinding, poorly maintained gears of a stompa to apply lubricant, a task where a single misstep meant being crushed into a red paste. The next, he might be a shovel git tasked with clearing out the pens of colossal, ill-tempered carnivorous squigs, their every moment a frantic dance to avoid being eaten. The worst job, the one that filled him with a cold, existential dread, was being assigned to a mech boy's workshop. Here, the very laws of physics seemed to be a matter of opinion, and human slaves were often considered a readily available resource. He had seen men used as living electrical conduits, their bodies convulsing as strange energies were passed through them. He had seen others used as target practice for a new experimental shooter. And he had seen them get the dreaded assignment of being ammo for a shock attack gun, their terrified screams cut short as they were teleported in pieces into the heart of an enemy formation. The Orks were not cruel in the way a human tyrant is cruel. Theirs was not a malicious, calculated sadism. It was the vast, unthinking, and utterly indifferent cruelty of a careless giant. An Ork might kick a human to death for being underfoot, and then a moment later offer another human a half-eaten squig leg out of a momentary whim, only to forget about it and step on him a minute later. To survive was to learn the rules of this insane new world, be useful, but not noticeable. Be quick, but not in a way that draws attention. And never ever look a knob directly in the eye. Not all of the surviving humans were reduced to this state. The Orks, in their strange, brutal way, possessed a concept of respect for a proper fighty opponent. The most resilient and warlike remnants of humanity were not enslaved, but were instead preserved. On a jungle-covered moon orbiting a mech world, the surviving regiments of the Catachan jungle fighters had been released. This was not a prison. It was a hunting preserve, a game park for the elite beast Snaga Orks. Periodically, a great hunt would be organized. A party of beast Snaga knobs armed with primitive harpoons and riding their ferocious squigosaurs would descend to the moon to test their skills against the galaxy's most famous jungle warriors. For the Orks, this was the highest honor they could bestow upon an enemy, a chance to die in a good fight over and over again. For the Catachans, it was a perpetual bloody hell, a constant war for survival against monsters who saw them as little more than dangerous, entertaining prey. Alaric, in his stolen moments of rest, would sometimes see the captured picked feeds of these hunts broadcast for the Orks' amusement. He would see the defiant, desperate faces of the Catachan soldiers, and he would feel a flicker of something, a ghost of his old, human pride. But the feeling was fleeting, quickly replaced by the cold animal cunning that now kept him alive. Hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. There was only the next kick to dodge the next scrap of fungus, to scrounge the next long, terrifying day to survive. After the initial glorious galaxy-spanning conquest, a strange and dangerous phenomenon began to creep into the new Orc-dominated galaxy boredom. With the major empires of Man-Eldari and the Necrons shattered into insignificant remnants, and the great war against the Tyranids grinding on in a distant separate corner of space, many sectors found themselves in a state of relative peace. For the Orcs, this was a crisis of existential proportions. A bored Orc is a dangerous Orc. Without a proper enemy to fight, the clans began to turn on each other in petty squabbles and disorganized brawls, a chaotic infighting that threatened to bleed the great Wa of its focus and its power. Gazgakul Thraka, the Beast. Ascendant, the prophet of Gork and Mork, understood his people's nature better than anyone. He knew that the Wa was a fire that needed to be fed. From his great scrap throne, he did not issue decrees of law and order to stop the infighting. He did the opposite. He organized it. He institutionalized it. He turned it into a grand, glorious, galaxy-spanning sport. This was the birth of Da Great Game. The concept was brutally simple. Gazkul would declare a planet, a star system, or even an entire sector as a fighting ground. The great Orc clans, the brutal Goths, the wealthy Bad Moons, the fast evil Suns, the primitive Snakebites, the cunning Blood Axes, and the morbid Death Skulls were now the teams. The objective was simple: be the last clan standing. The prize was the best loot, the most teeth, and most importantly, the bragging rights as the meanest clan in that part of the galaxy. This was not a civil war. A civil war implies bitterness, betrayal, and a struggle for political control. This was a celebration of everything it meant to be an Orc. The battles of Da Great Game were the ultimate expression of their culture. On the designated fighting ground of the ruined Fornax system, the evil Suns and the Bad Moons engaged in a season of war. It was a spectacular, insane festival of violence. The speed freaks of the evil Suns staged a massive system-wide race, their warbikes and buggies screaming through the debris fields of shattered Imperial fleets, while the flash gits of the Bad Moons tried to shoot them down with their massive gold-plated snaz guns from fortified rock bases. The Goths, considering all this racing and shooting to be a bit un-Orky, simply crash-landed their biggest gargants on a planet and had a good old-fashioned stomping contest. The Wa energy generated by these colossal organized battles was immense, a psychic feast that fed back into Gazkul, further cementing his status as the living god of the Orcs. He was not a king or an emperor in the human sense. He was the League Commissioner, the master of ceremonies for a perpetual tournament of violence. He did not care which clan won. His only concern was that the fight was big, loud, and brutal enough to keep the boys happy, and the power of the Wa at its peak. The system was a perfect, self-sustaining feedback loop. The fighting made the Orcs stronger. The stronger Orcs built bigger, better weapons. The bigger weapons led to even bigger, more glorious fights. For the few shattered remnants of the other races hiding in the dark corners of the galaxy, this was a spectacle of ultimate horror. They watched on their long-range scanners as their former home worlds, the sites of their history and their culture, were turned into the eternal playing fields for a blood sport of cosmic proportions. The Orcs, having run out of worthy enemies, had turned their violent, joyous gaze upon the only opponent that could ever truly satisfy them themselves. And they were having the time of their lives. The galaxy had not just been conquered by the Orcs. It had become their personal, perpetual, and very, very loud playground. At the very center of the new chaotic Orc galaxy, at a strategic nexus of former Imperial trade routes, lay the throne world of the Beast Ascendant. It was not a world in the traditional sense. It was a planet-sized junkyard, a perpetual mech town, and a constant low-level war zone known only as Da Big Scrap. This was the heart of the Wa, a holy site where every Orc in the galaxy dreamed of one day making a pilgrimage to fight, to loot, and to hopefully catch a glimpse of the great green god himself. And at the very center of this planet of junk, upon the highest mountain of twisted metal and shattered war machines, sat the throne of Gazgkul Mag-Uruk Thraka. The throne itself was a monument to his absolute victory, a work of art as brutal and as arrogant as the Ork race itself. Its foundation was the shattered, decapitated torso of a warlord-class titan from the Legio Mortis, its once proud heraldry now covered in crude, painted Ork glyphs. The back of the throne was the titan's own carapace, and the seat was the hollowed-out massive head of the god machine. It was adorned with the trophies of a galaxy-spanning conquest. Impaled on great iron spikes were the skulls of his greatest foes, or at least skulls that Gazgkul claimed were theirs, which in the reality of the Wa amounted to the same thing. There was the impossibly large horned skull of a greater demon of Khorne, the elegant crested helmet of an Aeldari autarch, and what he proudly proclaimed was the skull of a Primarch, its surface cracked and blackened. The tattered, shot-torn banner of the Ultramarines hung like a dirty rag from one armrest, while the fused metallic head of a Necron overlord served as a footstool. Upon this throne of blasphemy and conquest sat the Beast Ascendant. He was no longer a being of simple flesh and metal. He was a mountain, a 10-meter-tall colossus of green muscle and dark iron. His body a fusion of his own hyper-evolved form and the arcane machinery that had been grafted into him. Raw green Wa energy crackled and arced across his body in a constant miniature lightning storm, and his single blazing eye burned with the light of a dying star. He was a living idol, a god of pure, unadulterated violence, and around him his most powerful knobs and weird boys basked in his immense psychic aura. But Gazgkul did not rule. Ruling was boring. It involved paperwork and telling people what to do when they weren't fighting. He did not issue edicts or manage the logistics of his new chaotic empire. His method of governance was far simpler, far more direct, and far more orky. Before his throne, a choir of weird boys, their eyes rolling back in their heads, projected a massive, shimmering, and wildly inaccurate hololithic map of the galaxy. Gazgkul would watch this map for days, sometimes weeks, his massive head occasionally tilting as he observed the swirling green eddies of the various Ork war fronts. Then at a moment of his own choosing, he would act. His great claw of Gork, a weapon that had crushed heroes and demigods, would rise. His massive clawed finger would descend and jab at a random point on the map, a quiet, forgotten star system, a swirling nebula, a patch of empty void. He would grunt his voice a guttural earthquake that shook the very mountain of scrap. Dat he would declare his voice a psychic as well as a physical command. Dat looks like a good fight, and the galaxy would obey. The simple declaration amplified and broadcast through the gestalt consciousness of the Wei Agi was a divine command. All across the galaxy, billions of Orks would receive the vision. A speed freak in the middle of a race would suddenly get the urge to drive in a new direction. A war boss in the middle of a clan war would suddenly declare that their current fight was boring, and that the real scrappin' was elsewhere. Fleets would change course. Great migrations would begin. A new unified and impossibly vast green tide would form its destination, the single point in the galaxy that their living god had, on a momentary whim, deemed worthy of a proper battle. He did not command his empire with an iron fist. He was the Iron Fist, a being of pure, instinctual purpose, whose every idle thought was a holy decree that could move 1 billion ships and start a war that would consume 1,000 stars. The galaxy was no longer silent. The cold, vast emptiness between the stars, once a realm of profound and terrifying quiet, now thrummed with a new and eternal sound, the low, guttural psychic roar of the great Wash. It was a sound of 1 trillion Orks fighting 1 billion mech boys building and 1 million speed freaks racing. It was the sound of a species that had achieved its collective divine purpose. The Vox channels, once filled with the coded canticles of the Mechanicus and the formal communiques of the Imperial Navy, were now a chaotic, anarchic cacophony of war cries, insults, and the deafening, joyous noise of explosions. War had ceased to be an event. It was now the climate, the very atmosphere of the galaxy itself. Every world was a battlefield, a factory, an arena, or some chaotic combination of all three. Violence was the air, war was the water, and the deafening, endless noise of conflict was the new silence. And in this new galaxy, the Orks were happy. It was not the fleeting, complex happiness of a human, but a state of pure, simple, and absolute contentment. They had achieved their utopia. A typical Ork boy on what was once the civilized world of Ultramar would wake up in a crude, scrap metal hovel, grab his choppa, and join a colossal, city-spanning brawl against a rival mob, not for any strategic reason, but simply because it was Tuesday. After a good few hours of crumpin', he would share a roasted squig with the very same Orks he had just been fighting their previous enmity, completely forgotten in the shared joy of a good meal and the promise of another fight tomorrow. He might then help a mech boy build a new custom shooter, a process that would likely end in a glorious, non-fatal explosion that they would all find hilarious. There was no existential dread, no poverty, no political intrigue. There was only the perfect, simple, and joyous cycle of building things, breaking things, and fighting over the broken bits. They had turned the entire galaxy into their perfect playground, a divine gift to their gods, Gork and Mork, who were undoubtedly smiling. For every other surviving creature, this Ork heaven was a special, personalized kind of hell. In the stinking, fungus-choked pens of a squig world, the human Grot Alaric continued his miserable existence. His every waking moment a frantic effort to avoid being stepped on, eaten, or used as a living cleaning rod for a cannon barrel. His humanity was a distant, painful memory replaced by the low, animal cunning of a perpetual victim. In the hidden depths of the webway, the last remnants of the Eldari huddled in their silent, sorrowful craft worlds, now little more than refugee ships. They were prisoners of a galaxy whose very psychic resonance was a deafening, brutish roar that grated on their sensitive minds, their elegant culture now reduced to that of ghosts, forever hiding from the loud, boisterous children who had inherited their universe. On the tomb world of Somnus, the Necron legions of the Sarkovus dynasty were locked in an eternal, grinding war of attrition, their perfect, deathless legions forced to fight and reanimate over and over against an enemy whose illogical, reality-bending nature was a form of pure, mathematical torture to their ordered minds. The beast ascendant Gazgul. Thraka sat upon his great scrap throne on Da Big Scrap, the living god king of this new age. He did not rule. He simply was. He would watch the roaring chaos of his galaxy, and with a single guttural pronouncement would start a new war that would consume 1,000 star systems, all for the sheer glorious sport of it all. He had not just conquered the galaxy, he had fulfilled its ultimate terrible destiny, the great lie of the Imperium of man. The phrase etched into the very heart of their grim, dark reality had always been, "In the grim darkness of the far future there is only war." They had treated this as a curse, a terrible fate to be endured. The Orks had revealed the even more terrible truth. War was not a curse to be endured. It was a purpose to be achieved. And now, finally, that purpose had been fulfilled. The galaxy had not died. It had not fallen into darkness or silence. It had simply and very, very loudly become Ork.